Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of Bold Leaders in Learning. I'm your host, Brandon Busteed, and I am the Chief Partnership Officer and Global Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. Delighted to have Peter Smith with me today, somebody that I've known for a while. Actually, he and I first met when I was at Gallup and he was at Kaplan. And now here I am at Kaplan, and Peter is currently the Senior Advisor at University of Maryland Global Campus. But he has worn many hats and had quite a distinguished career in the education field and politics. Peter, we're going to talk about your new book today, but before we get there, tell us a little bit more about your background, which is a fascinating one, and then a little bit about the work you're doing at UMGC right now.
Sure. Well, I'll keep it brief because, as you know, I can suck up a lot of time. I was introduced at one point as a man with a great future behind him. So that's sort of the perspective. I've had an absolutely blessed, charmed career. I was founding president of what is now the Community College of Vermont, and it's in its 51st year when I was 24 in Vermont. I'm from Vermont. And after that, I spent about 10 years off for bad behavior in politics. I served in the state Senate as lieutenant governor and as a member of Congress for one term. As I was saying earlier, living proof you don't need term limits. I lost to a fellow by the name of Bernie Sanders, who the National Rifle Association had determined he was the lesser of two evils. So that's my footnote in political history. And then back into higher ed. I was dean of the Graduate School of Education at GW, and then had the incredible opportunity to be the founding president of California State University, Monterey Bay. So I spent 11 years there, and then to UNESCO, where I was ADG for education for several years, which was just an incredible, eye-opening global experience. And then back to Kaplan for 8 or 9 years as a senior vice president, which was just a wonderful stretch for me. And then now I'm at UMGC as a senior advisor to the president. And basically my job is to help them think, that old Wayne Gretzky saying, if you want to score, you've got to skate to where the puck is going to be. Well, where is the puck going to be in 5 and 7 years? And so it's just a wonderful job, and it's a tremendous team. New president Greg Fowler came to us from SNU, just doing an amazing job. So if you ever hear me complain about my career, kick me. It's been a great ride.
Yeah, certainly, fascinating background, tremendous mix of experiences, and part of what I think informs your book. I mean, you're a prolific writer, whether it's articles or previous books you've published, and you've obviously seen the higher ed and the workforce development world from a number of different angles. I've got your book here, Stories from the Educational Underground, and speaking of skating to where the puck is going to be, the subtitle is about the new frontier of learning and work. And so let's dive into the book. Tell us high level, what's the premise, what prompted you to write it? And then we can just dive into a bit of a conversation on some of the insights and where you think the puck is going to be opportunities.
Well, thank you so much. Writing this book has been a real learning journey for me. I did the interviews. It is mostly interviews of learners who were not well served by the traditional system. And it's something I've been toying with for years, but I hadn't, because most of my other books are arm's length analysis of what's going on. And I enjoyed that, and I always learned something. But this was really different because the pandemic hit as I was doing the interviews. And so, for all of us, the world sort of slowed down, and you began to see things that you may have been moving past before, insecurities, people who are living on the edge. And here I am talking with these wonderful people. And it was the premise that I started with, and is still a main one for me, is that we are allowing an enormous amount of talent and native intelligence to walk around in this country unrecognized because they cannot access the traditional system. That we've always sort of blamed it on them. It's like they lacked grit or this or that. And it's bad for them, and it is bad for them. But what I learned and what deepened for me, sort of went from being up here to down in my heart, what came on is it's bad for all of us, because our society doesn't get stronger when you are ignoring and denying talent and intelligence that we need, and the value of employing that talent and intelligence that they need. And so it just became to me, I've always thought about education as important. I'm not sure I ever saw it so deeply as a social justice issue. The things that you're doing at Kaplan, the things that we're doing at UMGC, speaking to 35 to 50 million people who have talent, who have some college, maybe a high school diploma, but we're not bringing them into the strong value that their talent and their intelligence and their knowledge deserves. And so it was, to me, and then what happened, and then I'll be quiet and you can ask me some questions, about halfway through, as I now can say without feeling too guilty about it, I'm exactly what I look like. I'm an icon of white privilege in a discriminatory society. And it came a point, I'd done the interviews and I said, oh my God, I can't write this book. What right do I have to stand on a stage and say, preach to people through the words of others? And I went to my wife and said, I got a big problem, honey. And she thought about it for a minute, God love her, and she said, interview yourself. Interview yourself as the exact opposite, as the counterpoint to the stories in the book. What is it like when privilege is baked into your life?
Yep.
When you get picked up when you fall down, where you have networks of authority and responsibility. And I thought, I can do that. And what happened was that because I'd already done the other interviews, I was looking at my life through their eyes. And it was a mind blow. And so that's chapter 1. It's called My Story, and it sort of sets the book up. And I've had a number of people tell me that they think it really helped the book say what it wanted to say by not leaving the other side of the coin blank, but saying, okay, and my first and favorite story. So I'm in the 9th grade at Burlington Junior High School, and I'm flunking algebra. My father's solution was to repeat the 9th grade at a place called Phillips Academy, Andover, one of the finest prep schools in the country. Well, it's not a bad fix, it's not a bad solution. 4 years later, I went to Princeton. 4 years later, I graduated magna cum laude, and 2 years after that, I started a college. None of it would have happened if my dad hadn't been able to bail me out in the 9th grade. Something would have happened. I'd like to think it would have been good. So to me, that's really deepened, the process of this book really deepened my understanding of how far we have to go in this country.
Yeah. And, to that point, I mean, you could argue that educational opportunity has more alignment with luck and privilege than being a given, right? And, that's just, pushing the edges of this conversation a little bit. But I go to some of the data that continues. I mean, it always bothers me. I don't know. I probably became aware of this, 5-6 years ago during my Gallup days, right? But you look at, we tend to think about higher education as that equalizer from a social, kind of economic social justice perspective, right? That going to college is this, ticket to a better life. And, and look, when it's done right, when it's done well, it is, okay? But it's not always done right and done well. And then there's the access and affordability and equity issues that are inherent with college, where, for example, over the last half century in the United States, last 50 years, the percent of people who were born into the bottom quartile from a socioeconomic perspective, who end up graduating from college, has moved from roughly 6 to 9%. 6 to 9%. Yet for those born in the top quartile, it's a little north of 80% right now. So you look at that, like, let's just round the numbers, 10%, 80% likelihood that you graduate from college, from the bottom quartile to the top quartile. I mean, it's a depressing statistic, right? Because we haven't really made any improvements in half a century, despite many well-intentioned leaders despite the fact that we do have colleges, community colleges, and universities who are doing a good job on access and equity issues. But if you just evaluate higher ed in the United States at a high level, gosh,
well, and your point is so well taken. The fact that, and it's not, what we thought in the 70s and 80s, it was like, God, we're trying hard. And, and somehow it just isn't working. But when you stand back and you get the whole 50-year, 70-year, to go back to the GI Bill, what happened was that in the absence of any ladder of opportunity through education, we got a ladder to opportunity, and it was a miracle, and it was beautiful, and it was unlike anything any society had ever done before. But then as jobs changed and it became the way you branded a credential was college, it wasn't an apprenticeship, it wasn't going and getting a job with a high school diploma. That ladder to opportunity became insulated and remote for millions and millions of people, cost, time, place, what expectations. And so this dream for those who could access it became a real nightmare for people who couldn't. And there was nothing, as I said, this isn't about good people and bad people. It's simply that the job we were asking higher ed to do has fulfilled the promise we had for it, but we didn't know that there's another 30 or 40% of the population that have the talent and have the capacity, but that pathway, they're like the kids at Christmas, it's a card I think of, the kids looking through the glass at candy in a candy store, and they can't get the candy because they're on the other side of the glass. And so to me, and I think that the one thing that there was an implicit assumption that it was somehow somebody else's fault. It was the fault of the learner.
Right.
And that's what I think is changing. And I think the pandemic has helped to change it. I knew it wasn't, but I never felt it because I hadn't lived it. And the closest I came to living it was interviewing these 20 incredible people and going through their life stories and what they had to deal with to become successful. And I say in the introduction, you could say they're the icons of the American dream. They are symbolically, but that is the wrong way to think about it. How do we make this happen for millions of other people who are equally as talented but can't find the doorknob to get through the door? Yeah. That to me is the problem we're facing.
Yeah, and then the talent, the loss, the talent opportunity loss is a real one, right? You made the point. It's not just that well, I benefited from it or I didn't benefit from it. I mean, there is an impact at an economic level for the United States, right? There's impact to entire communities and families. It's not just the individual who graduates who benefits. Right. There's a lot to it, and you and I are both very strong proponents of the value of higher ed, and we're also willing to be critics of where it's falling down. Mm-hmm. I go back to a speech I heard Mike Rowe give. Mike Rowe is the guy who got famous for being the host of Dirty Jobs, and right. If you just saw his show, you kind of think, oh, he's the representative of the blue collar working crowd, and to some degree, he's built that brand. But I saw him give a talk. And, he was a philosophy major in college. I mean, he had some really big thoughts around this stuff. And one of the things he talked about was, when he was in high school in the 70s, he remembers posters in his high school and in the guidance counselor's offices that were like, he showed a picture of one where he had a guy in a blue outfit with a wrench, and, it was like he was downtrodden and, had his head hung low. And then there was the college graduate with the mortarboard and looking great. Wow. And he said one of his premises is that the college for all agenda, as well intentioned as it is, right, has also had a really, really negative impact, right? And so I'm just curious. I'm thinking about Mike Rowe. I know you interviewed a lot of diverse learners in your book, but what would you say about the unintended consequences of the college for all agenda, right? Like how do you think about that?
I think they were unintended, and it's like you you start out to do one thing and you do it and it works. And then you realize that there is a byproduct that is unintended and is very negative. I think that is coming to an end point, quite frankly. And I think it's because college has moved. We already now know that fewer than 20% of the people who graduate from college do so by the age of 22. And the notion that when I see people suing MIT and Harvard or bribing to get their kids into USC, they're not paying for the education, they're paying for the brand. They're paying for a tattoo that says I'm special. And as more and more people get to express their talent and benefit from their talent, and as the society does, through entirely other means, some will be non-credit, some will be for credit, some will be come and go learnings, some will be certificates, some may stack up to a degree at some point. But the point is, as you start talking about the consequences of learning and the consequences of talent, you're spreading out what the benefit can look like, and you're legitimizing something. Why I call it Stories from the Educational Underground. I didn't know when I started this book that Goodwill, runs high schools all over the country, giving real high school degrees to something like 50,000 people. We don't know that, but we should. And that's all legitimate. So there are a lot of ways to get to Rome. And frankly, the degrees that I hold are not going to be as dominant a brand in 15 years as they were 15 years ago. I loved my education, don't get me wrong, but the minute we see that there are a lot of different ways to become recognized as capable, to tap into your talent, to help a business or an organization or a community get better, to take, because of all your talent, being able to take better care of yourself and your family and the people around you. The more alternatives we see, I think the more that the traditional vertical notion of college for all is going to get diluted. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, and you talk about pandemic, related impact and certain things like that. I mean, I think there's been a great acceleration of that dilution. Talk about a potential existential threat to the traditional four-year campus-based education, residential education, is online and hybridity, right? And we know that we're capable of delivering, if we do it right, high quality online education. The Zoom classroom, crash, of inexperienced movement to Zoom doesn't really qualify as high quality online education. But here's the point: there's a lot of students now who are demanding, as much as they're eager to get back to in-person, on-campus education, they still want to have options to take classes online. They want to have options to do virtual office hours with faculty, right? And so as we come out of the pandemic, I don't think the hybridity is going to go away. But now, how do you square that with charging as much as we do, right? And saying, oh, geez, the only way to do education is if you come to campus, you live in a residence hall, et cetera. When on the other hand, you've got situations where, and you're reading this in the news, faculty who are actually protesting having to come back to the classroom. We would have never imagined that 3 years ago, Peter. They protested moving online. Now they're protesting coming. So there's even faculty who are preferring to, be able to have the option to teach remote or do a mix of these things. So, I mean, I think that alone is going to lead us to rethinking, the ways that this can be done. And even traditional higher ed is going to look very different, let alone all the alternatives that are coming up.
You're dead on, because the fact of the matter is there are so many angles of entry to that issue. How is the world around the institutions changing? And it's changing dramatically. At the same time, if you look at the history of the whole student loan debacle, again, an unintended, I think, consequence, but what happened was all of a sudden, the cost of college, Tony Carnevale and the guys at Georgetown would say the cost of college has gone up something like 10 times faster than disposable income since 1990. Yeah. Well, what that is huge burden shifting through loan debt onto the backs of students and their families. So we have something that is, as a business model, unsustainable. And I mean, will colleges admit 25% more students and require that every student take at least 1 year off to do a work project someplace that supports them so that they can create more income with the same? Look at what Michael Crow's doing at ASU. So there are answers for traditional institutions. But having said that, what we're also finding is, if learning how to think critically is important, does it matter that we learn to think critically and write well because we study an Emily Dickinson poem or American history? Or can we learn to think critically and write well while solving other problems that may relate more to an occupation? And so to me, what you're seeing, and in the book, towards the end of the book, I talk about when we make just practices good practice, because we all talk about best practice in higher ed. But whether or not you're in a community-based program or an employment-based program or a campus-based program or a low residency program, we have crossed a threshold where the respect for the background of the learner, the respect for what the learning is that they bring with them, understanding why they've come to us, what they want from us. My metaphor is an emergency room. You know, if we ran my eldest son's an ER doc, so I think I know more than I do. But we treat students, or historically, if they treated them like that in an emergency room, they'd say, gee, come back when your temperature's down to 101 and you're feeling a little better. No, they take the most serious case and they put them in the front of the line. Now, medicine isn't education, but the fact of the matter is we have some of that mentality. Success is called persistence. It's like, this is hard. This is nasty stuff. You're climbing K2 in sneakers. Baloney. Learning is hard enough by itself, but we need to make sure our best practices going forward include what I call just practices that are founded on respect for the learner, their background, where they come from, what they want, and put the learner first. And I think that's going to change a lot.
Yeah, so take us into a couple, we've got about 8 minutes left in our time. Take us into a couple of the stories from the underground here. Give us maybe your two favorite stories of your interviews that you did. I'm sure that's gonna be a tough one to whittle down.
Well, I'm going to leave the names out because that's a little bit much. But there are a couple that two or three that I remember. One, an immigrant parents come to Canada, son is born. The guy has developed and sold a business for $1.5 million before he graduates from high school. A lot of things go on. He ultimately moves down to the Silicon Valley. But the first college degree he gets is an MBA. No certificates, no associate's degree, no baccalaureate. And the story of that is simply he went to a community college and they said, the teacher just said, no. And took him to the dean of the business school. And I said, so did you learn anything new? It's really interesting what he said. He said, not much, but what I got was a framework to put the experiential learning I'd already done in. It helped me organize my thinking. It helped me understand more clearly what I was good at, what I liked to do, and what I wasn't good. So for him, it was a massive clarifying exercise. To me, that's a great example of what happens, whatever the educational setting, if you can take personal lived experience and blend it with the structure of the curriculum or the framework for learning, the two together are way better than either by themselves. Then there were several of them had been incarcerated, and the stories of some of it, like transitions. One fellow is talking to his I think 14-year-old daughter. He's in jail, and she says, "Dad, if you do this again, I'm never going to talk to you again." And it changed that moment. He said, "Okay," and he started working in college. Then he got out, when he was still incarcerated, got out, got a job, went to school, Uh, he went to College Unbound, which is a really interesting place in Providence, Rhode Island, that is totally community-based and employment-based. A woman who was sexually abused by multiple family members, lived 2 lives for years and years, had huge aspirations, could just never get to them. And then at about age 55, found an employer who trusted her, saw her native intelligence, saw what she brought, and boom, 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 boom. 4 years later, she's got a degree and she is the vice president of a company that's a national company. So I break the stories into, there are the people who I called them the hurdlers. They'll go over, under, around, or through. They're just amazing. Then there are people, they're riding a merry-go-round and it's going, they just can't get off the damn thing. And then there's people who just keep, and then they do get off. And then the people who just keep plugging, and finally it works. But what happens is how they interact with the elements of privilege, identifying a mentor who's real, identifying a network of that's real, that will introduce them and trust them to opportunity, somebody who will pick them up when they fall down, somebody who will confront them with a reality that forces them to deal with it or not. Those are the things, and I tell the story, one of the things I learned in Princeton from a history professor had nothing to do with history. I'm acting out in my sophomore year. I'm a cool guy. And he throws me out. And he says, don't go away. And he comes out at the end and he grabs me and puts me up against the wall and he says, don't you ever waste my time again. Don't you ever, you're smart. Don't waste my time. And he walked off. And I went back to my room and said, that guy thinks I'm smart. That guy thinks I'm worth something. And I'm sitting here being a jerk. And I didn't learn a history lesson that day. I learned a much more important lesson. And so that needs to happen. People, he cared. And so these people all found people who cared. And what was amazing, as they were able to alter the arc of their lives, it was because of one of these elements of what I defined as the privilege I took for granted happened in their lives, and they were able to grab it and go. And we need to do that for more people, a lot more people.
Yeah, that magic element of mentoring and somebody who cares just comes up everywhere, right? And that was one of the centerpieces of the Gallup Purdue Index study that I helped lead when I was at Gallup. You look at the magic ingredients of developing somebody, a human being, into their full potential. It's another human being or more, who have taken a special interest, helped them out,
Amen.
So, this is true, across the board, but especially true for underserved students, right, who haven't had that support from a family or a social network perspective or whatever it might be. But, it tells us that, like, if we're really going to scale this, there's a couple things that we've got to scale, and all of us have to be involved. One is internships in various forms. And, employers can complain all they want about the lack of work readiness of graduates, but they've got to start to turn that right back to themselves and say, well, what's the big thing missing? It's you not offering enough, paid internship opportunities, by the way. And
right.
And then, it's mentoring, right? And whether that source of mentoring is a faculty member, an upperclassman, a staff person, a volunteer, it doesn't matter what the source is. The question is there somebody there, right, who's gonna lend you a helping hand in some form? And boy, we all could afford to figure out our roles in being part of those two things, in internships and mentorship.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. And to me, one of the just practices you're going to see, and some institutions are beginning to do this, but is assigning a concierge type person, not an academic advisor, but a person who's there for you. And when you have a problem with financial aid or a parking ticket or your father dies or you get divorced or whatever happens, when life happens to you, you've got somebody you can call who's going to help you figure out what to do. So you don't just look like a dropout or a push out or a this or a that. And I think that's going to become, with adults especially, whose lives are busy, it's going to become, and the respect that comes with that kind of treatment and relationship, I think is going to become critically important.
Yeah, and the good news is, we're seeing examples of schools that are doing just that, right? Kind of a unified advisor, consistent advisor role, and there's no doubt that that's going to be, those who really figure that out and do that at a world-class level. It's going to make all the difference in the student experience and the long-term outcomes. So I'm a huge proponent of that kind of model, and excited to see.
We're on that path at UMGC, and
Yep.
to that, I would add validation of learning wherever it happens. We have got to stop ignoring the talent and the learning that people bring with them.
Right.
And however we do it, we can do it a lot of different ways. But there's some things like that just will reduce cost, reduce time, increase success because it's respectful. It's going to be a good time to be around.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you on that. As much as there's reason for pessimism, there's a lot of optimism out there. Peter, thank you very much for being part of the show. For those of you who haven't, please pick up his book. Obviously, some really important and powerful stories in there. So look forward to catching you again some point live and in person, but always great to talk to you. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Great to be with you.